readers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire Books, and I'm here for a very special conversation about the Book of Longings by Sue Monk Kidd. So my own educational background is in New Testament. I have a PhD in ancient Christianity. I didn't want to do this alone. I brought on two other New Testament experts. So let's start with Sara Ronis, who you've seen on this channel before. Tell us about yourself, Sara.
Hi, everyone. So when I'm not visiting Liz's booktube, I am a professor of theology at St. Mary's University, which is in San Antonio, Texas. And my PhD is in ancient Judaism. So I'm coming to this book as an expert in the Jewish world at this period. And actually, really coincidentally, right now, I'm teaching a course on Second Temple Judaism, and we just spent a day on Jesus. So I'm really coming at this from the perspective of what the Jewish world looked like into which Jesus and his fictional wife lived.
Fantastic. And then I also have Allison Gray, a New Testament expert. Introduce yourself to us, Allison.
Hello, my name is Allison Gray, as Liz says, and I am also a professor in the theology department at St. Mary's University in San Antonio. So Dr. Ronas and I are colleagues, and we don't actually work on exactly the same thing. So my expertise and my PhD is in early Christian literature. So I actually look at the New Testament, but also early interpreters of the New Testament and the Old Testament for Christians, Hebrew Bible. So my take on this book is also going to be thinking about interpretation and how this is itself an interpretation of the New Testament. So thank you for the invitation.
Yes, and so for those of you who are watching, it may seem like it is actually a really weird coincidence that y'all are in San Antonio. So my hometown is San Antonio, but Allison, I met you when I was an undergraduate at U Chicago. And Sara, I met you when we were both doing PhDs at Yale. So we all know each other from different parts of our lives, which I actually think is really cool.
Actually, when I got this job, when I saw Allison's name, right, like Allison was also, we were hired at the same time. I sort of put out an email, like, maybe I think I searched through Facebook, like, what mutual friends do we have? And you were the only one that popped up. So nice full circle here.
Yeah, that actually makes this an extra special combo. All right, so we're going to talk in depth about what happens in this book. If you want a general review with no spoilers, I would actually recommend that you go elsewhere. But we are going to talk about the Book of Longings as a book first, and then kind of as scholars next. So I guess to summarize, the Book of Longings is about Jesus's wife, but it's not Mary Magdalene. It is a young, well-to-do Jewish woman named Anna, whose father is a scribe for King Herod. Y'all can absolutely start adding on to this.
So the only thing that I might add is that it's a work of fiction. It's explicitly a work of fiction, so she's not sharing some new scholarly insight or hasn't found a new gospel, right? This is her imagined interpretation of what Jesus's life might have looked like with a wife and what kind of woman might have married Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you think when people think of Jesus' wife, they usually think of Mary Magdalene, but Sue Monk Kidd takes it in a different direction. We have this totally invented woman who meets Jesus and falls in love with him. And they really do have a loving relationship. And it's very interesting to see sort of what a romance with Jesus might look like.
Even though that sounds to us sort of shocking, right? It's not a part of the biblical tradition. But I was listening to an interview with the author, Sue Monk Kidd, and one of the things she said was, I wanted to write to open up our imaginations and stop putting Jesus into a box in some ways. And so taking that sort of lens on the story, she does sort of unpack or try to include surprising incidents in the story. How does Jesus interact with his family members in the household, right? We get this great insight into what it would be like to live in an ancient home, who would do what kinds of work. And so it was both grounded in things that are familiar, but also adding on new dimensions. And I thought that was a really powerful kind of approach to history.
Yeah, and Sue Monk Kidd really tries to get, I think, a range of experiences in there. And I think that she does that by making Anna someone she is wealthy. She's expected to marry someone wealthy. Her parents are social climbers within within, the sort of Hellenistic Jewish world of this time. And Sarah, that may be something that you could put into context better for us. But then she kind of gives up her old rich girl life to go be with Jesus, and she adjusts to that, which is also interesting. And in some ways, the book is really more about her than it is about him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in fact, when you said, with spoilers, at first I sort of chuckled because I was like, I'm pretty sure, when we're recording this, Easter has just happened. Like, I don't know how many of your viewers don't know the story of Jesus. And there might be many, but, it's funny to me to think of like, well, we won't spoil a 2,000-year-old account. On the other hand, the fictional life of this woman, right, like could be spoiled. So I definitely hear that piece of it.
Yeah, I like to tell, I'm about to teach New Testament again for the summer, and I love to tell the kids, spoiler alert, he dies at the end, but it's not But Sarah, could you maybe tell us a little bit about your perspective on Anna's world and like the kind of life that she traverses throughout the book?
Yeah, so there are some things that I just really liked that Sue Monk Kidd did. I think so often when we talk about ancient Judaism or early Christianity, we kind of imagine that it's one thing, right? That there's ancient Judaism and it looks like this everywhere that Jews were, and they all did this and they all believed this. And I think one of the things that Sue Monk Kidd does so well is to really highlight both the regional diversity of the Jewish world. Anna spends some time in the Galilee, she spends some time in Alexandria, and then she spends some time sort of in a suburb outside of Alexandria. And those are really different worlds. I think Sue Monk Kidd does a really good job of showing the ways that different genders and classes would have experienced Jewishness and just being alive in different ways. I think she does a really good job of showing the range of ways that different Jews and Jewish communities dealt with Rome. She definitely doesn't go into a lot of detail about just how and why Rome was so terrible for the Jews at this time. And I recognize this is a work of fiction and it's not a horror novel. Like that story might actually be a horror novel, but she does do a really good job of showing how somebody like Anna's brother is going to respond in one way by wanting to rebel, and her parents, right, might be responding by saying, okay, we're going to accommodate to the point of assimilating and and try to gain power in this new system, especially because you'll notice both of them are people who didn't necessarily have access to power under traditional pre-Roman structures.
Right.
And then you also see this rise in messianism and an apocalyptic expectation, right? This idea that things are so bad that something better must be coming, and what living under that kind of, Paula Fredrickson calls it this frenetic energy. I think she does a really good job of just showing you the complexity of ways of being a Jewish person living under Roman persecution in the first century, in different places and in different bodies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what's interesting is so this is a spoiler for those of you, you'll figure it out like 2 seconds into the book, but Anna's brother is Judas, Judas. And but what's interesting is that all this political stuff is happening, but really the story is about Anna and her own sort of journey towards self-actualization and a life that she finds fulfilling. So throughout the book, she shows an interest in writing. She wants to get her voice out there on the page. She wants to express herself. And I think it's actually something that she says, I want to be a voice. Let it be said about me that I was a voice. And, even though the story has Jesus in it, it's really about her trying to figure out who she is and what she has to say. And would y'all say that in that sense, the story is a happy story, even though, obvious events occur?
I think maybe not happy, but hopeful, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that she takes on as a writing project is interpretation of scripture. She basically does midrash, which is this practice of taking gaps in the biblical tradition and sort of filling in with what was this woman's story. We get a one-line reference in scripture, but I want to know more about her and what must have happened to her. So one of her projects is like retrieval of women's stories from scripture. And she writes also what she calls texts of terror, right? To preserve the story of her friend who has been raped and mutilated. That's not happy, right? But it is sort of hopeful that through the power of this story, the woman has a voice. And so I think that the hope also comes from the way that Anna herself tries to be in solidarity with these other women and with community. And so I found that, I mean, at least from a modern perspective, right, that's a very empowering kind of story that feels hopeful. I'm going to be a mouthpiece and an amplifier for stories of other people in the way that I can. So hope.
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo something that Allison just said, which is, I think the ways that Kid depicts female friendship as sustaining, and that's female friendship with, you know, her friend Tabitha at the beginning, who she totally dismisses as like, you know, a ridiculous person who's totally not serious, but turns out to be like a very profound person. I think that the friendship between her and her older aunt, and thinking about multi-generational friendship and what that does. I mean, there's so much in the book. There's so much in the book that is just these like depictions of the casual cruelties that women and girls can face in the world, both in the ancient world and today. That to me, you know, what I take from all of it through the ending really is just the power of resilience. And I think that is hopeful. Hope isn't the word that I came to, but I think just the power of resilience and the ways that people don't have to be resilient alone, that we are resilient within networks of supportive people.
Yeah, and that's something that Anna does experience throughout the book. You know, her constant companion is her aunt, who has her own troubled past and is sort of like a wicked woman who goes around doing unwomanly things and being a bad influence. But she's like actually awesome from our perspective as modern people. And, you know, yeah, she has a friend named Tabitha who does reappear later. At one point, Anna and her aunt go and join the Therapeutai, who are depicted in this particular work as a group ruled by a woman that is very tolerant of women and that, you know, protects them from men and their garbage in Anna's life. Yeah, it's, and then of course, her cousin then later appears. Like there's a priestess of Isis who is somehow like, yes, but the divine, it's all the same sort of thing, really. I will come hang out with the Therapeutai as well. And, you know, I have thoughts about that, but, you know, overall as a story, it's actually really, really nice because it really is about women coming together. It passes the Bechdel test with flying colors.
Yeah.
Like in some ways, you know, Jesus is almost an obstacle maybe to her in the story. I don't know. Do y'all agree with that take?
So I have mixed feelings, right? So on the one hand, it's really lovely to read a love story where both people are able to follow their life passions to a certain extent. Like in some ways, Anna gets interrupted in that, but I don't know that it's Jesus actively trying to stop her as much as maybe not fully understanding what it is that she wants, and also life circumstances.
Yeah.
So I think this is one of the stories I've read recently where I felt like here we have people who love each other and support their individual paths and goals without trying to impede anybody's development and growth, which you don't always see in contemporary romance.
Yeah, I don't think Jesus gets in her way. I think poverty gets in her way. Because all of those things, right, all of the chores that she's doing, the fact that once she marries Jesus, she can't afford paper, that's not because of Jesus, that's because of major income inequality. So, you know, and to me what that really highlights, and again, right, like this is the teacher of Second Temple Judaism speaking, the fact that there were all of these people who lived these fascinating, thoughtful, sophisticated lives we can't even imagine because they couldn't afford ink and paper, or because they didn't have the time to learn to read and write, to write it down. Yeah, I don't think Jesus gets in her way. I think systemic inequality gets in her way.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about it more in terms of, so, when she's living with him, they're generally happy together. She wants him to come home, but he starts leaving for longer and longer periods of time, and he wants to become a follower of John the Baptist. And then he ultimately takes over the movement. And I feel like it's almost like his departure and then her going to Alexandria in response almost frees her in a way to actually go and be who she is. Just in that, by separating, they're each following their own separate missions, which I do think echoes a little bit of what Allison's saying, right? Where they're a loving couple, they support what the other is doing. It's just that it can't actually be done together within the context of the book.
It makes me think of, the academic job market is so rough. But I have a number of friends where both of them have PhDs, but in order for them to do what they love, they had to do it in different places and see each other on breaks in the summer. And the ways that you have to make kind of decisions about your many passions and how to balance all of that, I think is a very modern, right? That's not just an ancient question.
Yeah, and of course, it's cool that it is a question in this book, because that is Anna's agency coming through in ways that maybe her mother didn't get that, or Tabitha wasn't going to get that.
And it's also incredibly accurate for the time. Lots of people, and by people I mostly mean men, traveled for work, and lots of women then lived lives that were largely independent of their husbands, except for on the weekends or when their husbands would come back.
Right.
And so I think there is something really authentic about that in this period.
So speaking of authenticity, so first let's just cap this off. How do y'all think that this book worked as a book? Did you enjoy the experience of reading the story? Did you think that it was a fun novel to read that you'd recommend to other people on that level?
I did very much enjoy it, and I'll just highlight a couple of things that I thought were super well done. So one, we all know it's one of those stories where you know what the ending is going to be, right? You know that Jesus is going to die. But the way that she got us there, and to sort of bring in Anna's perspective and where she was and how she had to travel back and who was with her and what she experienced as she saw it, sort of made that passion narrative that I read, 8,000 times a year for class, made it new. And I feel like I'm in a weird position as a Bible scholar that, like, the way that I read that doesn't emotionally affect me, right? But in this book it did, and that was really interesting to me, and I thought well done. The other thing, and we can talk about this in more detail, I thought that she did a good job of talking about somebody's religious life, about their faith experience, without getting too saccharine, right? Especially in a story that's about self-actualization. I always worry, like, we're gonna bleed over into like way too touchy-feely. But I think that she walks that line really well. Anna is a real person. She is both rational and emotional, and I think it doesn't feel fake to me.
Yeah, I have two minds of this. So I really resonated with the idea that you have a teenage girl who just thinks that there's more to her and to her life than is available to her, and also isn't delusional, right? Like, she is correct, and over the course of her life figures out ways to take that bigness that she felt as a teen, that I think so many of us are conditioned out of, and really to make that her life. Now, the flip side is I think it kind of dragged in the middle. I thought the beginning was really engaging. I thought the end was also really engaging. Both of those, the end took about a year, maybe, I think, in the timeline, and the beginning time in Sepphoris was her teen years, but somehow it just felt like a lot more happened. That middle chunk where she is married and getting used to domestic life and then eventually ends up going to Alexandria, to me, that pacing just seemed a little off.
Yeah, I think that there's something to that. I think so. I really enjoyed the book from beginning to end. It was at no point was it a chore to read. I do think that at some points, even though I think Anna's interest in the largeness inside herself, right, as she says, was really something I resonated with. At other times, it was almost like she was a little too perfect you know, like the first time she really tries to write an artistic piece, she like writes the Thunder Perfect Mind, and like we'll talk about that in a moment. But like there's something a little Mary Sue-ish about her, but the book was interesting enough and enough interesting stuff was happening that I still thought that it was a good read. And I also think that I would say that with care, and we'll talk about this, I think it's a really worthy read.
I do want to just push back for a minute on
Yeah.
the Mary Sue piece, which is to say that I think, you know, if we look at how historically that critique has been leveled, it's been leveled by men who think women are too perfect. When if you think about men, I don't know, like Luke Skywalker, who can shoot the thing even though he's never shot the things before.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah.
Alderaan, nobody, well, that's not realistic, right? I think she can be annoying, but I think I don't know that critiquing her as too perfect is really what's happening there, especially because she is clearly, I mean, she isn't nice to Tabitha at the beginning.
True.
There are some ways where and she's also been writing for a very long time when that happens, when she writes Thunder Perfect Mind. So I'm just saying, I agree with you that she is depicted as special and powerful.
Okay, yeah, that's fair.
I don't know that she's perfect, and I don't think she's good at that the first time she does it, right? That's the juxtaposition of, and she says she's written psalms already and hymns and a number of other things. So
yeah,
I have critiques of the book.
Oh, that's fair. That's fair. But I guess what I mean too, though, is that like, you know, with her and Jesus stuff, like they have these deep talks about God that sound like kids in a college dorm in some ways, where, you know, it's like, oh, God is everywhere. Why can't it just be this? I guess that's what I really mean by like perfect in the sense she's perfectly accepting and able to like make her worldview this very modern, incredibly modern worldview just out of nowhere. Except that it's not out of nowhere because it's out of us, which I think actually leads to the next part of this conversation, which is, so as scholars of the New Testament, you know, how do you feel about this book as a commentary on history and maybe about ourselves doing history?
I'll jump in. I mean, I think it's exactly that, right? So even when we think about the Gospels themselves, they are in the first century retellings of events that happened. And so evangelists who write these stories down are filtering the events through some lens that's aimed at an audience, right? It's having some kind of didactic purpose. And it's also picking which parts of the source material are most interesting or most relevant. So I think that this story is Sue Monk Kidd doing the same thing, right? She is writing a gospel, but about Anna. And so we get to see a little bit of biographical background, but we only highlight certain moments that are most important. And so it's, as with any evangelist, we learn a lot about them by reading what they think is most significant. So I would say, and Sue Monk Kidd, I think, confirms this when she talks about the book, like she's coming from a Southern Baptist traditional setting where she felt like, I'm a woman and I don't have a voice in this tradition. And I need to discover my place. And so she writes an Anna who is also grappling with that same struggle. So we really see what she thinks is important in religion and what is important about self-discovery by looking at what she highlights in the character.
I think that's so, that makes me think so much of something, Liz, that you said earlier, I think, which is that like, oh, well, they're all the same God or whatever, right? And this is an idea that is called perennialism, right? That sort of we're all on a mountain, but we're all getting to the same path. And I think it's really, really common. Right? Many of our students are like, well, you know, but we all like really want the same thing. And one of the things that I push against in our intro to theology classes, like, do we know? Right? Like, actually, the goddess Isis and the God of Israel are not the same. Like, I don't know if you knew that, right? Spoiler alert. They're not the same. Like a polytheistic goddess, Egyptian goddess who's shaped by a Hellenistic world, and the monotheistic God of Israel are fundamentally not the same. And if you don't understand that, then you don't understand why, for example, Rome was so bad in this period with this people, or what these cultural clashes and conflicts really came to. So Allison, I really appreciated the way you just framed that, because you're right. What she's doing is talking about what she wants the world to be.
Yeah.
And sort of naming that, setting that in an ancient world, but in ways that, you know, say a lot more about us, perhaps, than they do about that world.
Yeah, I think so. I think the reason I keep harping on the Thunder Perfect Mind, right? Like, oh, Jesus' nickname for me was Little Thunder, and it leads up to her being, you know, so the Thunder Perfect Mind, for those of you who've not read it, I'll put a link in the show notes, just a translation of it, it's everywhere. Is
put the commercial.
Oh, yes. So it's a poem that was found in the Nag Hammadi Library, which is a collection of texts that are generalized as Gnostic. They are texts that mention Jesus, but in ways that are like weird mixes with Platonic philosophy, or with, you know, these kind, you know, when people are like, ooh, the Da Vinci Code, oh, these different visions of Jesus, like a lot of that comes from little snippets that we're pulling out of things like the Nag Hammadi Library. And so those texts are not considered to be contemporary with the time that Anna is living in. And so it was weird to have that come out of her mouth and to have those ideas come out of her, mainly because I associate that text with other texts that don't at all fit with this book. But thematically, the Thunder Perfect Mind fits great with Anna. So it was a really interesting cherry pick, because I can see why Sue Monk Kidd chose it. I think it's a little convenient if you're trying to see it as history, but if you're trying to see it as like, okay, something from the ancient world that resonates with me now in modern times, I can see why a person would pick it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think, you know, that's such an interesting choice, because if you look at the Nag Hammadi Codex, I think it's really fair to say that the authors loved God, and they really didn't like Jews. And so the ways that then this text gets put in the mouth of a Jewish woman, I think points to some of the bigger problems I saw in this book and its depiction of Jews. And I think this goes back, Allison, to what you had said before about the ways this says something about, you know, the world that the author lives in. And I think it's really important to name the world that we all live in is a world that has been shaped in important ways by anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. From the original breakup of Judaism and Christianity, right? The minute that they are two separate things, you have Christians, you know, I always talk about this like as a breakup, right? You have Christians looking at their exes and trash talking them and be like, I don't know how we were ever together, right? There's all of this stuff that happens there. And I think without any kind of personal animus, right? Or any kind of intention to do it, this book plays into some pretty toxic tropes around Jews that I definitely wish had been handled with more sensitivity. And I'll give you just sort of two examples of this. The first is the ways she depicts the Pharisees. They're only depicted a couple of times in the books, but the words that get associated with them are the words wealth, fanatical, and then essentially quoting from Matthew 23 about how they're hypocrites. And lots of scholarly research has shown that the Pharisees actually were cross-class. They were not terribly, in fact, they were of the more moderate groups in this period. And there's a wonderful article by the scholar at Boston College, the late scholar Anthony Saldarini, pointing out that Matthew 23, as Allison already pointed out, right, these texts tell us a lot more about their writers than they do about the people that they're writing about in a lot of ways. And so Matthew 23 is this extensive call out of the Pharisees, but it's a call out of the Pharisees from another Jewish person who is competing with the Pharisees for the same followers, right? So sort of imagine two groups in a square, you know, and they're trying to get people to come to them by trash talking each other, almost like right, like imagine a rap battle, right? That's essentially what this is.
Yeah.
Except we lose all that context, and then you just think, oh, everything that guy said in that rap battle is an accurate depiction of his opponent, right? His opponent's mother really is whatever, right? Like No, he's
I love
not.
this analogy.
This is
This is
genre
great.
convention,
Yeah.
right? But when you sort of pick that up and then just sort of say it uncritically, that gets a little problematic. And let me give you another example, and then I'll tell you why they're problematic, right? So the other one is rabbis. Rabbis show up in this book a lot. We actually don't have lots of evidence that rabbis as a group lived in the first century, but the rabbis as depicted as a group, right? The title shows up, people are called rabbi as a title of respect, but it's not clear that it like meant something about a social group with its own rules and standards. But she describes them as close-minded, toadies of the Roman Empire, ignorant, controlling, and keeping women and bastards out of the synagogue, and as only thinking that men are of value and important. And each of these is just like a little piece in the book, you know, it's like each of these is a throwaway sentence. And I get that. But when you put that together with the Pharisees piece, right? Pharisees and rabbis are the two groups from the ancient world that are associated with modern Jews, right? That sort of are tied into a genealogy of how Jews today are who Jews today are. And so when you buy into these incorrect and offensive stereotypes, right? You know, there's a reason that every Marvel movie starts with like the origin story for that hero, right? Because where we come from shapes who we are and how we're going to respond to new situations. And so these depictions of the groups that end up being Jews, according to this sort of genealogy, kind of buys into some pretty negative stereotypes about Jews today. And they're so baked into the culture that like I have no doubt in my mind that this is completely unintentional, right? I have no doubt in my mind that this was not on purpose. But I do think it's a really important reminder for us that, you know, what we write reflects our world, and we have to be really critical about our world, because just passing on toxic stereotypes can continue to do harm.
Yeah, if I can jump on, we were just talking in the advanced theology class today, we're talking about martyrs and ascetics, but we're currently talking about embodiment in that context, and then gendered bodies, disabled bodies, Jewish bodies. And so we were reading an article, long story to get to this, we were reading an article about how contemporary Christian preachers can avoid ableism and anti-Semitism in a sermon.
Julia Watts-Belzer?
Julia Watts-Belzer and Melanie Morrison. So it's walking this fine line, right? Because what happens is when you try to say, well, the critique here is not about particular people, or it's about the structure, right? And it seems to me like that's the direction that Sue Monk Kidd is trying to go. Anna exists inside a repressive structure, and she's trying to become free. And in Sue Monk Kidd's mind, because she is in this contemporary Christian context, the structure is restrictive Christian church structure that limits women and their sense of possibility. But because she's critiquing structure, she's then saying structure is the problem. I'm going to import that back onto Jewish structure and then reinforce and carry forward this anti-Semitism. So just maybe another way of adding to exactly what you're pointing out, that we make these easy equations, and with a little bit of historical knowledge, we can break down contemporary Christian church structure is repressive in ways that do not map nicely onto ancient Judaism, right? And so to make that equation is dangerous.
And I also want to point out, I'm not saying that varieties of ancient Judaism weren't repressive, right? Or that they weren't structured in ways that could cause harm.
Right.
But I think it's really important for us to recognize that the kinds of harm that are caused in the world today are not necessarily the same kinds of harm that were caused in the ancient world. And she does such a good job of showing that regionally, right? Showing the ways that these different communities have different structures. And yet in every community, there are rabbis, right? No matter where she is, there are these rabbis who are getting in her way or supporting the Roman authorities.
And I think on the other end, the communities that she depicts as good, I think are maybe presented in a little too rosy a light. You know, I never got the impression that the Reputi were that progressive, you know, or, you know, the way that Jesus is presented as being, you know, Jesus says things like, you know, not a letter from the law will be stricken away until, you know, all these things are fulfilled, or, you know, I come not to bring peace but a sword. You know, Jesus has his own firebrandy moments in the text that we have about him from the ancient world, and yet he's kind of a hippie in this particular rendition. And that's not a bad thing necessarily, but it's almost like these structural complaints are put onto, you know, the hierarchy of the time in a way that is maybe unnecessarily negative, in order to present Jesus and Anna's aunt and the therapeutai in these ways that are super progressive in like our culture, and that are very, very positive, and also kind of not very structured at all. And I find that fascinating because, again, I think that this is something, I think everybody has urges to connect with life, and maybe not for me because I'm an atheist, but like, you know, with like the divine and some sort of, like, people want a sense of purpose and people want a sense of connectedness, I think, no matter what their background is. But that idea that I can be the one who mediates that, I'm sure there have always been people who have been interested in it that way, but I don't think that ancient people, including Anna, for example, would have conceived of their own personal religious freedom in that same exact way that it shows up in the book. It's sort of like it's fiction, but it's just like when you write history, right? You're writing the history and then you're also writing yourself, and there's always two stories happening. And I think that's really, really true with this book. There's like the story that she's trying to tell is she's piecing together the research that she did, and that story is deeply affected by her own story that she needs to tell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, you know, it's that piece that it's the own story. So I'm going to say a radical thing, which is that in both Judaism and Christianity, Jesus isn't the end of the story, right? And so, you know, you had mentioned Thunder Perfect Mind, and yeah. Thunder Perfect Mind is part of a religious movement that develops after the death of Jesus. The story starts with her aunt, whose name is Yalta. And so Yalta, fun fact, Yalta is one of my favorite female characters in the Babylonian Talmud, but she lived in like the 3rd or 4th century, but she's phenomenal. I mean, like, Google Yalta. Google Yalta Talmud, not, otherwise you'll get the Peace Accords or whatever that was in World War II. But the book starts with her writing this bowl, and we actually have no evidence of incantation bowls from Egypt. And we have no evidence of incantation bowls from this early. The incantation bowls as a cross-religious movement emerged in Babylonia, in what's now Iraq, and scholars debate how early they are found, but they're definitely not 1st century. And I think part of what happens when you collapse all this stuff to make a really progressive Jesus and Anna is that you lose the ways that religious people continue to evolve and change after this, right? If everything interesting happens before Jesus, then like that's the end of the story. And I know that that's the way that so often that story gets told, but I think it is of value to see this first century moment, this moment of Jesus and Roman conflict and Jewish messianism and questions about the temple, right? This is actually a really fruitful moment that leads to I'm gonna get creative here and say, right, it leads to this blossoming of new religious ideas and movements in ways that I think you miss if all the cool stuff happens in their lifetime. And again, this is my bias because I studied the period like starting here, but continuing for the next 600 years. But, you know, not all the cool stuff happens in one person's lifetime. And maybe a little bit as I was reading this, I felt like I was reading Forrest Gump, where like he just shows up at every interesting thing that happens for like 50 years, right? Like not everything happens in their lifetime is all I'm saying.
Can I say, though, that there's, to just sort of push back on that a little, I think one of the things I liked about this book is that it does what some of the best interpretations of the early Jesus story do, which is capture that different people who observed him from different standpoints had a very different take on him, and that there are all these stories about Jesus floating around simultaneously. So she just collapsed a little bit of that into his lifetime in ways that I think are inauthentic, historically speaking. But Judas thinks about him very differently than Anna thinks about him, very differently than his mother and the family in his household think about him. And then one of the things I loved is that Anna just goes on with her life, and we get this vignette of her years later where she's like, oh yeah, there were like stories that are starting to be told about Jesus, but she's not that interested. I feel like that's such a great depiction of how people in the time period did respond to him, right? So we have this distinction between the historical human Jesus and then the theological claim that he is the Christ, the Messiah, and all the stories that that generates. And I think the book does a nice job of like showing that those are not connected for everybody. So I would add this on my list of like things that do a good job with that, the multiple stories that are multivalent. And you guys all know what the best ones are, right? Life of Brian is absolutely the best at like multiple narratives happening at once. Gerd Tyson does a more scholarly one called The Shadow of the Galilean, where there's somebody who is assigned to like research Jesus and never meets him, but picks up stories and different depictions from other people. And then my personal favorite, Christopher Moore's Lamb, the Gospel According to Biff, Christ's childhood friend. It's absolutely delightful. But I think that she does a decent job with that near the end of the book, the multivocal, multivalent stories about Jesus that start to emerge based on historical events in his life.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you completely, Allison. And what that makes me really think of is, I think that this is a really powerful book for people to read and talk about with some guidance. I think that this is the perfect book to read in a book club together with something about Second Temple Judaism. I think sometimes we pick up a novel and, like there are things that I think I know about the world, but only from novels, and I don't think critically about it. I think this is a really powerful book. And I could see like 15 ways I could teach this book. I could see, all kinds of book clubs I could have with our majors or something about this book. I would be worried that somebody who just picked this up to read and didn't have a critical lens, but thought, especially because in some ways Sue Monk Kidd talks in the epilogue about how much research she did. If somebody thinks this is an accurate depiction of the world into which Jesus was born, I would be nervous about that in terms of what you might be mistaken about that world. But I think it's a super rich book for us to think with in all kinds of ways.
I agree. I want students to read this, and I also want to talk to them about it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I want there to be this is a conversation starter and a source for more questions that we can discuss.
And in fact, as I was reading it, I kept thinking to myself, like, I can't wait to talk to Allison and Liz. Right. I got the invitation and then started reading the book. Right. Liz was like, there's this book. It's about the first century. We're going to read it. We're going to talk about it. I was like, okay, cool. And then as I was reading it, every time something came up, I was like, I have a PhD in some of this stuff, and I can't wait to talk to other experts in different parts of this. So yeah, I definitely think this is a really fruitful book to have a conversation about.
Yeah, and I think this conversation actually really helped me appreciate the book more, because don't forget, like, again, as a secular person, sometimes I have my own little blinders that I forget I have. And, when she was talking about this research she did, I wanted to engage it kind of as a more historical argument, and that frustrated me. It made me feel very upset because I don't like this book as a claim to a historical depiction of this in a scholarly kind of like, you can trust this depiction of the ancient world kind of way. However, hearing you characterize it as something that maybe more in the tradition of the Gospels themselves, or of the sort of rich, like, fan fiction is what I would actually call it, that emerges about Jesus after his death. You have the stories of the apostles, and you have the infancy Gospels, and people have a hunger for the life of Jesus and for what it was like that is not satiated by what is in the New Testament. And
never was, right?
And never was. Never. Like, not even for a little bit.
Even like in the Gospels themselves, you get two endings in John, because he's like, oh yeah, let me tell you one more story. Okay, now I'll wrap it up again, right? You get double ending.
Right. Like, no one can get enough. And I sort of feel like this book is in that tradition, if that makes sense. Like as a work of history and historical research that you can trust, no. But as maybe a true expression of our enduring curiosity about and interest in this time and the thoughts that were happening at this time and the way that we can apply them to ourselves, which is what literally every ancient person did. We can pretend that it's more original, but actually even the earliest things that we have are essentially the early version of somebody's lens about Jesus. I think that maybe the book is an expression of that tradition as opposed to something to be viewed in a more factual way. Does that make sense?
It does. And one of the things I love about that is that it highlights that this is still a living tradition and that there are still individuals and communities seeking out that connection. And if they don't find a connection that's meaningful for them, they're forging their own. And I think that's an incredibly powerful statement about how religion works.
Yeah. So I want to thank you both so much for coming on and having this discussion with me. I really appreciate it. This was enlightening for me. Hopefully people who watch will also enjoy this. Do you guys have any last words before we sign off?
So I just wanted to recommend, if you read this book and you were thinking to yourself, "Ooh, I really like historical fiction about ancient Jewish women who are badass in all kinds of ways, and also maybe incantation bowls," there is a novel by an author, Maggie Anton, called Ravisda's Daughter, and maybe if we could put an insert, because that's going to be hard to spell, which is about a 5th century or 4th century CE Jewish woman in Babylonia who is engaged in this world of women's spirituality and religious practice within the rabbinic community, which is fascinating and also has a love story. So if you read this and your thought was, I really want more badass Jewish women from the ancient world, I would definitely recommend that. And then if you read this and you're like, ooh, I want more interpretations of the life of Jesus, I would actually recommend just YouTubing plays about the life of Jesus, because especially now with so much on Zoom, there are plays about the life of Jesus that you can find from countries all over the world, from cultures all over the world, seeing how different communities have forged these connections to Jesus in ways that the gospel authors just never imagined. So there's a lot out there depending on what you are interested in based on this book.
I love that. My final word is just thank you to both of you for an engaging conversation, for the invitation to think more about this book in a way that wasn't just about how I experienced it, right? Think a little more critically out loud. So I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. Those of you who are watching this, hopefully leave a comment, leave a like, and maybe we'll get back to you and keep reading. Happy reading, everybody.